It was the dead of winter. Snow piled high on empty streets. The wind howled through a narrow alley, a forgotten place between the towering buildings. No one should have been out in this cold. But then, a sound. A security guard on patrol froze. A faint, desperate cry. Not a cat, not the wind, something else. Heart pounding, he followed the sound, pushing through the icy darkness. And then, he saw it. A baby. Alone. Abandoned. Shivering. Dying. And the only thing keeping him alive? A stray cat. Curled tightly around the newborn, its thick fur shielding the baby from the lethal cold. But what this cat did next, no one could have predicted. The alley stretched into the darkness, a forgotten sliver of the city where only the desperate dared to linger. Cold wind howled through the narrow passage, stirring old newspapers and rattling loose boards. The scent of damp cardboard, rotting food, and the metallic bite of winter filled the air. But amid the ruin and neglect, a flicker of life remained. Masha. She was only a stray. Just another cat in a city that had no shortage of them. But tonight, she was something more. Her fur, thick and matted from years of surviving the streets, bristled against the cold. Snowflakes clung to her whiskers, melting into tiny beads of water that dripped onto the fragile skin of the newborn she was shielding. The baby stirred, letting out a weak, pitiful cry. His breath came in shallow gasps, the faintest puffs of vapor visible in the freezing air. Masha curled in tighter, wrapping her body around him, tucking her tail close. Instinct guided her. She had never nursed kittens of her own, but something primal inside her understood what had to be done. She could feel the infant's trembling, the sharp, unnatural cold of his tiny fingers against her belly. The cold was an unforgiving thief. It stole warmth, breath, life. Masha had learned that long ago. But she wouldn't let it take him. Footsteps. Distant, hesitant at first. Then quicker. Louder. Approaching. The security guard had been making his usual rounds, expecting nothing more than an empty alleyway and the occasional stray animal darting between the shadows. But the cry had stopped him. A sound so small, so fragile, yet impossible to ignore. As he neared the alley's entrance, his flashlight cut through the dark, a stark beam slicing through the swirling snow. He swept it across the dumpsters, the abandoned crates, the damp piles of discarded rags, until it landed on something unexpected. A shape. Low to the ground. Moving. He stepped forward, heart hammering. Then, the beam caught a glint of green, eyes staring back at him, unblinking. Masha. The cat didn't flinch under the light. She didn't run. She only held her ground, her body curled protectively around something the guard couldn't quite see. And then, beneath her, he saw it. A bundle. Small. Motionless. His breath caught. He moved closer, lowering himself carefully, the crunch of his boots muffled by the thick snowfall. His hands trembled as he reached out, brushing aside the thin, damp fabric wrapped around the baby's frail body. The child barely reacted, save for a faint whimper. Skin too pale, lips tinged blue. He could feel the cold radiating from the tiny form, leaching into his own fingertips. A sickening realization hit him. The baby should be dead. No one could survive long in this kind of cold, not like this. And yet, here he was. Still breathing. He looked back at the cat, who hadn't moved. She watched him with something unreadable in her gaze. A silent challenge, almost. The baby was alive because of her. Slowly, cautiously, he reached for the child. But the moment his hands lifted the infant from the frozen ground, Masha reacted. A sudden, low growl rumbled from her throat. She didn't lunge, didn't attack, but she stood her ground. Her tail fluffed up, ears flattening slightly against her head. The guard froze. She wasn't just watching over the baby, she was guarding him. Snow continued to swirl around them, the wind howling between the buildings. The baby let out another faint whimper, barely louder than the wind. He needed warmth. He needed help. Now. The guard exhaled slowly, keeping his movements deliberate as he unzipped his heavy coat. He wrapped it around the baby, tucking the child close to his chest. The infant stirred slightly, his tiny fingers twitching against the fabric. Masha took a step forward. Then another. He stood, cradling the baby carefully. As he turned toward the alley's exit, the cat did something unexpected. She followed. Step for step, never falling behind. He glanced down at her, the weight of the moment pressing on him. She wouldn't let them take the baby without her. The guard tightened his grip on the child, adjusting his coat around him. The warmth of his own body would have to be enough, until they got help. His boots left deep impressions in the fresh snow as he moved toward the street. Masha's paws left lighter imprints, barely visible in the darkness, but she never stopped following. A single street lamp cast a dim glow ahead, marking the entrance to the city's main road. Somewhere beyond it, there was warmth, light, safety. But behind them? A frozen alley. A dark, empty space that had nearly swallowed a life. Nearly. The wind howled again, rattling loose metal and sending a fresh spray of snow across their path. The guard hunched his shoulders, shielding the baby's fragile form as best he could. Beside him, Masha pressed on, her eyes locked forward, determined. She had made her choice. And she wasn't turning back. The hospital doors slid open, flooding the dimly lit sidewalk with harsh fluorescent light. The security guard stepped inside, clutching the infant tightly to his chest. Warmth. Shelter. Hope. But just behind him, at the threshold of the automatic doors, Masha stopped. The sterile smell of antiseptic drifted out, mixing with the crisp night air. Voices echoed inside, urgent, clipped commands from nurses and doctors preparing for the emergency arrival. The baby let out a weak whimper, barely audible over the commotion. Masha's ears twitched. Her tail flicked. The doors whooshed shut. She sat there, eyes locked on the baby as the guard hurried toward the ER. For a moment, it seemed like her part in this story was over. But then, she moved. The doors slid open again as a nurse rushed outside, and in a swift, silent motion, Masha darted forward. "Hey! There's a cat," someone started, but Masha didn't stop. She weaved through legs, dodging hurried footsteps, slipping past rolling gurneys. The security guard barely had time to react before a nurse gently took the infant from his arms, rushing the tiny body toward the examination area. Core temperature dangerously low. Possible frostbite on the fingers. Get warm fluids ready, stat. The words blurred together in a rush of movement. The guard exhaled, running a hand through his snow-dampened hair. He had done his part. The baby was safe. Or so he thought. A presence brushed against his leg. He looked down. Masha. She sat at his feet, tail wrapped around her paws, watching the scene unfold. She wasn't leaving. A nurse noticed her. "Whose cat is this?" She's not mine," the guard admitted. He hesitated, glancing down at the scruffy tabby. "But I think she's with the baby." The nurse frowned, about to respond, when a sharp beep sounded from the monitors. A doctor stiffened, heart rate dropping. The tension in the room tightened like a rope pulled taut. The infant, barely clinging to warmth, let out a fragile, gasping cry. Too weak. Too cold. Masha's ears twitched. She knew that sound. The same cry she had heard in the alley, muffled by snow. The cry that had kept her there, that had made her stay when she could have run. Without hesitation, she moved. A doctor stepped aside for just a moment, long enough. Masha leapt onto the gurney. Gasps filled the room. A nurse reached out to pull her away, but... Wait. The room stilled. The baby had stopped crying. The nurse closest to the gurney froze, staring. His breathing, it's stabilizing. The doctor frowned, eyes darting between the baby and the stray cat now curled protectively beside him. Then, he noticed something. Tiny traces of fur clung to the infant's damp skin, a thin layer of warmth that had shielded him from the worst of the cold. The cat's own body heat had kept him alive far longer than medical science could explain. She saved him, someone whispered. No one dared to move. Masha blinked slowly, her body pressed against the child's fragile frame. Her warmth radiated through the thin hospital blanket, her purring a low, steady vibration. For the first time since being found, the baby didn't shiver. The security guard exhaled. The weight of the moment settled in. This wasn't just luck. Masha had kept him alive once. And she was doing it again. A quiet murmur passed through the room. No one questioned it anymore. She belonged here. Time passed in a blur. Doctors worked carefully, monitoring the baby's vitals, ensuring his body temperature rose at a safe rate. Nurses whispered among themselves about the miraculous cat who refused to leave his side. And through it all, Masha remained. Silent. Watchful. Unwavering. Hours later, the crisis had passed. The baby, now wrapped in layers of warmth, slept peacefully in the neonatal unit. His tiny fingers twitched in his sleep, a sign of strength returning. The security guard sat in the waiting area, hands clasped together. Exhaustion weighed on him, but relief was heavier. At his feet, Masha stretched lazily, her tail flicking. She had done what she came to do. And yet, she still wasn't leaving. A soft chuckle escaped the guard's lips. He shook his head. Guess you're sticking around, huh? Masha yawned in response, curling into a tighter ball. He smiled. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the city in an icy hush. But here, inside these walls, in this moment, warmth had won. The realization rippled through the room like a shockwave. A stray cat, a creature no one had given a second glance, had done something miraculous. She had saved a life. The paramedic gently peeled away the last layer of the baby's blanket. More fur, clinging to the damp fabric, weaved into the tiny fibers. A fragile, invisible shield that had held off the deadly cold. The baby should have been ice. He should have been gone. And yet, against all logic, he wasn't. The medical team exchanged glances, unspoken questions hanging heavy between them. No one dared to say it outright, but they all thought the same thing. If not for Masha, this baby wouldn't have made it. The security guard took a step back, running a hand over his face. Had he really almost separated them? His gaze dropped to the floor. Masha sat there, her tail flicking, her green eyes locked onto the baby's fragile form. She wasn't leaving. A nurse knelt beside her, hesitant, as if approaching something far greater than a simple alley cat. Slowly, she extended a hand. Masha didn't flinch. She didn't hiss. She didn't run. She just watched. You knew, didn't you? The nurse murmured. Masha blinked. A doctor let out a slow exhale. Let's focus on the baby. His core temp is stabilizing, but we need to monitor him closely. The spell broke. Movement returned to the room. The nurses adjusted the blankets, checked the drip, noted down vitals. But Masha didn't move. The security guard crouched beside her. All right, girl. You did your part. He gave her a small, uncertain smile. Time to get you somewhere warm too, yeah? For the first time since they had entered the hospital, Masha shifted. But instead of moving toward the exit, she padded forward, straight to the gurney. She jumped up. Gasps rippled through the room. Hey, a nurse started, stepping forward. But then she stopped. Masha wasn't climbing onto the baby. She wasn't getting in the way. She just curled up at the foot of the gurney, tail tucked neatly around herself, watching over him like a silent guardian. No one spoke. No one stopped her. Because somehow, it felt right. The baby let out a tiny, hiccuped breath. The machines beeped in a steady rhythm. The room, once thick with tension, seemed to settle. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Then another. The baby's color improved. His breaths grew stronger. The medical team worked carefully, ensuring he remained stable. And Masha? She stayed. Even when a nurse offered her food and water, she barely acknowledged it. Even when the security guard tried to coax her away, she only flicked an ear in his direction. Her place was here. A few hours later, the baby was officially out of immediate danger. The doctor sighed, rubbing his temples. That's one lucky kid. The security guard glanced at Masha. Lucky or protected? Silence. No one answered. Because deep down, they already knew. The baby would sleep safely tonight, wrapped in warm blankets, surrounded by doctors and nurses. But if anyone had truly kept him alive, it was her. And she wasn't going anywhere. The hospital buzzed with whispered conversations. Doctors, nurses, reporters, everyone wanted to know more. Who would abandon a baby in the freezing cold? And how had a stray cat, of all things, been the one to save him? Masha sat just beyond the entrance, her fur ruffled by the winter wind. Snowflakes clung to her whiskers, but she didn't move. She was waiting. For what? No one could say. But she had already defied logic once. Who's to say she wouldn't do it again? The investigation begins. The police worked fast. Security footage. Witness interviews. They pieced together the heartbreaking truth. The mother was young, barely out of her teens. Alone. Desperate. She had left the baby in the alley not out of cruelty, but because she thought no one would find him. That he wouldn't suffer. But she hadn't counted on Masha. And now, because of that cat, she had been found too. The city reacts. The news spread like wildfire. Every outlet covered it. Morning shows, online blogs, even international headlines. Stray cat saves abandoned baby from freezing to death. Masha the miracle cat. Donations flooded in. People wanted to help. Not just the baby, but the mother too. Her story wasn't simple. It was one of hardship, of choices no one should have to make. And though the law would decide her fate, the public didn't just see a villain. They saw a victim. A girl who had lost all hope. And a cat who had given it back. The baby's recovery. Inside the hospital, the infant was growing stronger. Warm hands held him now. He was fed, comforted, protected. Exactly what Masha had tried to do. Doctors still marveled at how close he had come to death, and how a stray had done what even humans had failed to. Kept him alive. But as they celebrated the baby's survival, another question remained. What would happen to Masha? A cat without a home. For days, Masha lingered outside the hospital. She didn't meow for food. She didn't beg for shelter. She just waited. And people noticed. Families lined up, eager to adopt her. They offered warm homes, soft beds, endless treats. But Masha didn't belong to just anyone. She had chosen her place that night. And so, as applications poured in, one man stepped forward. The security guard. The decision. He had been there that night. He had seen Masha curled around the baby, refusing to leave his side. And in a way, he understood her. She had been a survivor all her life. Just like him. I ain't never had a pet, he admitted, standing in front of her. Don't even know if I'd be any good at it. Masha blinked up at him, tail flicking. But I figure if you can save a kid's life, you can handle putting up with me. He held out a hand. A silent offer. And this time, Masha stepped forward. A new beginning. The transition wasn't easy. She was wary of the indoors at first, pacing near the door, as if expecting to be put back outside. But the apartment was warm. Safe. Her new home. She had a name now, Masha. No longer just a stray. And every night, when the security guard came home from his shift, she was waiting for him. Not in the snow. Not in the cold. But right where she belonged. Some say animals act on instinct. That they don't understand love, or sacrifice, or loyalty. But Masha? She proved otherwise. And maybe, just maybe, that means your pet would too. Would your pet do the same? Let us know in the comments. And if you love incredible animal rescues, check out our next video. It's a story you won't believe.